Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I will proceed with my opening statement at this time. I want to thank our witnesses, including the two members of Congress who have joined us today for this important hearing on the burgeoning growth of alternative transportation companies. I will be calling them TNCs. These are companies that use technology to provide rides on demand. The two largest TNCs that make up 98% of the market, Uber and Lyft, were, of course, invited to join us, but they declined. However, Congress cannot avoid its responsibility to investigate its role in overseeing this industry. Uber and Lyft have missed an important opportunity for them, but that will not stop this committee or this subcommittee from doing its duty. Today, we will hear from members of Congress and other witnesses who reflect the tough, outstanding questions to ensure that the TNC mobility option actually delivers a public service safely and equitably, and operates in the interest of the public and for its workers. We will hear today about important public safety concerns that arise when companies develop an app that connects passengers and drivers through technology and hope for the best, without appropriate scrutiny and rigorous background checks. We also will hear the effects on hundreds of thousands of workers who are left with little choice in today's market but to drive for Uber and Lyft to supplement their low wages that affect so many Americans today. We will hear about the efforts of workers to organize to achieve improvements in income and working conditions. We will hear about impacts to mobility in cities when more TNC vehicles are permitted to flood roadways and block curb cuts without thoughtful rules in place to mitigate congestion. We will hear about the impact of TNCs on existing transportation networks, such as transit systems. Today's hearing marks the first serious discussion about how to harness the power of technology and innovation to deliver benefits to riders while providing appropriate guardrails to ensure safety and accountability. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and to ask questions. I now ask our ranking member if he has an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairman Afl-Cio. I also want to thank our two colleagues who have joined us today, Mr. Smith from New Jersey, Mr. Swazi from New York. I look forward to hearing your remarks, and it's been great to sit down and work with each of you on issues that are important to the hearing that's going to be conducted today. Our public roads are a shared resource, and our job is to figure out how to best manage this shared and ultimately scarce resource. Over the past decade, we've seen an unprecedented explosion of a new player on public roads, TNCs. The mobility landscape has been completely reshaped, and the growth for on-demand shared mobility has required states and localities to think how to plan for and organize their road and transit systems. The number of monthly active Uber users rose to over 100 million globally this year, and with over 15 million trips happening each day, this represents a huge shift in how Americans are getting around on a day-to-day basis. TNCs aren't just focused in big cities either. In my district alone, which is a mix of rural and many urban areas, Lyft conducted over 62,000 rides last year. And today, Uber serves more than 82% of the US population, upwards of 268 million people. And while Uber and Lyft may not be able to serve every small town and city across the country, their presence and innovation has spurred other ride-hailing alternatives. And one of them today we're going to hear about is from Mr. Martz from Commute with Enterprise, who is working to make carpooling easy for companies and commuters. But while we're all excited about the prospects for new integrated mobility options, we must be cognizant of its risks and impacts, both for riders and drivers. The safety of our traveling public is of paramount importance, and regardless if you're traveling in a taxi, taking public transit, or riding through a TNC, you need to feel and be safe. For example, in my district, it's home to 4 public universities, including Illinois State University, and that university alone has over 20,000 students. And we must be sure to protect the safety of every one of our campuses across our country. With that, I again want to thank our witnesses for being with us this morning, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. I'd like to ask the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, if he has an opening statement.
I certainly do, Madam Chair. Am I recognized?
You are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair. Today, the hearing is on a topic that is having already far-reaching implications on transportation mobility in our country. And this hearing should also serve as a wake-up call to companies that have flooded our roadways with disruptive technologies and investor capital, that their days of operating with little public policy and regulatory oversight in the transportation space are coming to an end. The transportation landscape in many cities has been upended by these TNCs, transportation network companies, led by Uber and Lyft, who refused to testify today, having led us on for 6 or 8 weeks saying they would testify. They just told us on the holiday weekend they wouldn't come. They have their transformative technology platforms, connecting riders, revolutionize travel, the way we travel. But there's a lot of problems with this model. First off, TNCs are contributing in a major way to traffic congestion. In San Francisco, where the very first Uber ride was taken in 2010, in 6 years, traffic delays increased by a total of 40,000 hours, vehicle miles traveled increased by 630,000 miles, and half of them are attributable to TNCs. That, private and even shared TNC rides add more congestion and more emissions, not less. How these new technologies are integrated into our existing systems, what rules TNCs must follow, must be carefully crafted to ensure that these services are truly a good option. Lawmakers at the federal, state, and local level need to think far beyond just whether this new service gets people from point A to point B, what this new business model means for public safety, jobs, emissions, transit service, and other factors must be at the center of any policy decisions to allow these companies to access our infrastructure. The failure today of Uber and Lyft to appear is a telling sign that they don't want to answer questions on the record about their operations. I read a news account today that they've met with all the members, or almost all the members of the subcommittee, and had great conversations. Well, they didn't come to see me. Now, perhaps they don't want to talk about their public safety problems. And I'm grateful to Representative Smith and Swazi for being here today and starting off this hearing with statements and their ideas on how to improve the safety of ride-hailing services. I have been focused on the potential dangers of pairing passengers with poorly vetted drivers for years. In June 2015, I wrote to then Uber CEO Travis Kalanick, urging the company to conduct fingerprint-based background checks. 4 years later, the process that Uber and Lyft use to vet drivers is not fingerprint-based. It's woefully inadequate, leaving passengers vulnerable and at risk of harassment or assault. In my district, in the small city of Eugene, Oregon, they vetted 13 drivers as being right up to the standards of Uber and Lyft. Unfortunately for them, my city requires taxi drivers, and they were deemed to be taxi drivers, to take a fingerprint background check. Oh, guess what? 13 of them were convicted felons. One was a sexual predator. One was a murderer. And they were all just good to go as far as Uber and Lyft. And then Uber and Lyft show up in my state legislature and try and preempt communities from having higher standards. They spent millions of dollars in Texas on that same issue. They don't want people to be fully vetted because they want anybody and everybody who can get behind the wheel who might or might not have a valid driver's license to be driving for them. This has got to end. Now, you know, they are also, as we've seen, making a lot of their employees yet another victim of the gig economy. California has deemed that these people are employees. Uber and Lyft say, no employees, not employees, contractors. We have no liability, no nothing. They just use our platform. Except they extract massive payments from these drivers, and the drivers are totally dependent upon the system. And now they're sponsoring an initiative or trying to sponsor an initiative in California to repeal that law. Now, so it could be public safety, it could be abuse of their workers and what they're doing to them. Many of these people are working, according to calculations, at less than the minimum wage in these states. Of course, they're contractors. They don't have to get a minimum wage, $9.81 an hour. That's less than the minimum wage in my state. Now, they don't reveal the data on the prevalence of assaults. They don't reveal any data on how people are paid. Uber has posted more than $5 billion in losses in the second quarter of this year. Lyft, $650 million in loss. That's despite employing felons, sexual predators, paying abysmal wages. They're still losing money. This is not a sustainable business model. At the same time, they're asking us, the United States Congress, this committee, to consider subsidizing their operations if they partner with transit agencies and local governments to provide connecting service to existing public transportation. In surface transportation reauthorization, this committee will certainly evaluate how to incentivize greater transportation options. Overcoming our congestion mobility challenges, particularly in urban areas, will require some innovative solution. However, this hearing should put those not here, Uber and Lyft, on notice that for their long-term survival, for any hope of ever partnering with agencies who utilize federal funds, they're going to have to clean up their acts, and they've got to come forward. And if they don't come forward, we'll legislate without hearing from them. With that, Madam Chair, I thank the other witnesses who will be here today, and yield back my time.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, because it is important that this Congress do its work. That's why we are going to act based on the testimony we hear today. Now, I would like, before proceeding with panel one, to invite my colleagues, Congressman Thomas Swayze and Congressman Christopher Smith, for opening statements for 5 minutes. Mr. Smith or Mr. Swayze, whichever of you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Eleanor Holmes Norton, thank you, and Ranking Member Davis for calling this hearing, and Chairman Afl-Cio for that very, very passionate set of comments, very well spoken. For the invitation to speak on Sammy's Law, a comprehensive bipartisan legislative initiative designed to more seriously protect passengers, especially women, who utilize rideshare services, including Uber and Lyft, from sexual assault and other forms of violence. The idea for this legislation came directly from the grieving parents of a young woman from my district, brutally murdered by a fake Uber driver. Now, however, we know that there are significant personal safety concerns associated with actual Uber and Lyft drivers as well, not just the fakes that are not well appreciated or publicized, and I'll speak to that more in a minute. Last March, University of South Carolina senior Sammy Josephson left a late-night outing with her friends alone because she had to work early Saturday morning. The extraordinary talented student who had recently earned a full scholarship to Drexel University Law ordered an Uber. In a congested part of the town, a predator, pretending to be an Uber driver, took her into the car and brutally murdered her. Less than 24 hours later, her dead body was found in a field. The murderer was caught, jailed, and now awaits trial. Almost immediately, Madam Chair, and notwithstanding their excruciating agony, and you met with the parents, as did Mr. Davis, as did Mr. DeFazio, despite that agony and the loss of their precious daughter, Sammy's parents, Seymour and Marcy Josephson, began pushing for federal and state legislation to better ensure that no one else loses their life or gets assaulted by a rideshare driver or a predator who pretends to be. Working with the Josephsons, my good friend Tom and I crafted a bipartisan bill that would push states to require front license plates and, above all, scannable codes such as QR codes on both back passenger side windows that riders could scan on a smartphone device to verify their ride before, and I say again, before entering that vehicle. The bill provides a rider with the ability to opt out of using a QR code by instead using a 4-digit personal authentication number to be verified again before entering the vehicle. I want to point out that the personal number was an excellent idea suggested by the National Federation of the Blind, who have endorsed the bill, and I would ask that their letter endorsing the bill be made a part of the record. These measures would not only ensure vehicle and driver identification for riders, assist law enforcement in tracking harmful offenders, but protects drivers as well by confirming the passenger. The legislation also makes it unlawful for anyone other than a transportation network company like Uber or Lyft to sell a ride-hailing sign. Today, anybody can buy an Uber or Lyft sign on Amazon or elsewhere for as little as $10, enabling the fakes and the predators with the appearance of signage legitimacy. Additionally, Sammy's law requires the GAO to study the incidence of sexual and abuse of riders and drivers, and the nature and specifics of any background checks, how credible are they, of drivers and state laws that may require such checks. Madam Chair, in April of 2018, an investigation by CNN pointed out that after searching police reports, this is their quote, federal court records and county databases for 20 major cities, they found that 103 Uber drivers have been accused of sexual assault or abuse. However, the story notes that the numbers suggest that there may be many more overall incidents of abuse than the 103 cases. They told the story of a woman who had passed out in the back seat of an Uber. When she regained consciousness, the driver was on top of her, raping her 1 block from her home. The police picked up the man, John David Sanchez. They found videos of Sanchez raping other women and abusing teenagers dating back 5 years. In November, he was sentenced to 80 years of prison for those horrible crimes. What kind of background check did Uber do on this particular individual who did such heinous things? The report notes that Uber was made aware of CNN's reporting for the story, but the company failed to make any executives available, and it canceled an on-camera interview with an Uber executive. They didn't show up today either. Last month, 14 women sued Lyft for mishandling their sexual assault complaints against drivers. It was carried by The Hill. Some of you may have seen it. I read each of their stories, and that number is growing. Again, we're talking about predators, and these are Uber and Lyft drivers. In this case, it's a Lyft driver. The GAO study, I think, will provide us very, very important information about what they are doing, and it is the final part of the bill. Finally, due to the incomparable courage, compassion, and advocacy of Sammy's parents, Seymour and Marcy, the state version of Sammy's law, which is almost identical to our bill, it was a template for that bill, and I want to thank the Senate President Sweeney for his insisting that they follow that pathway. It was signed into law by Governor Murphy of New Jersey on June 20th. They did act very quickly. New Jersey, at least, New Jersey citizens are more likely to be protected than other states. And again, we're hoping that this bill will prompt those other states to do all that is humanly possible. We're not looking to eliminate this. We're looking to make sure when you get into that back seat, it's safe.
Thank you very much, Congressman Smith. Congressman Swayze.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Davis and all the members for allowing us to testify here today. We appreciate it very much, giving us the courtesy of going first like this. We know you have a tremendous challenge trying to determine the policies that are necessary to try and ensure that the new industry of transportation network companies provides safe, efficient, and cost-effective solutions to both consumers and employees. It's hard to imagine that Uber and Lyft didn't actually show up here today. It's really very disrespectful of the committee, and it's a bad play on their part, I think. I'm here today with my colleague to talk about Sammy's Law, which Congressman Smith and I have sponsored. I'd like to thank Congressman Smith for his leadership on this issue. He's done a lot of hard work here. Earlier this year, when news reports about the murder of Sammy Josephson first came to light, a New Jersey friend of mine and a neighbor of the Josephsons contacted me to work on legislation to ensure that no other parent would experience this devastating loss in the way that the Josephsons did. I later discovered that Congressman Smith, who represents the Josephsons, was also working on this issue. Sammy Josephson called for an Uber, entered the wrong car, and she was murdered. This Smith-Swazi bill works to provide consumers with a level of safety before entering the vehicle. Our bill's safety provisions are common sense and easy to implement, including the following requirements for states. 1, require a scannable QR quick response code on the vehicle window that matches the QR code on your phone. And as proposed by the National Federation of the Blind, an audio personal authentication number in lieu of the QR code to make sure that this is the correct car before a passenger enters the vehicle. Require transportation network companies to have illuminated signs that are visible in both day and night and that are readable from 50 feet. 3, require TNC drivers to have both front and back license plates. Currently, 19 states require only 1 plate. And 4th, prohibit the sale of illuminated TNC signs and the display of such signs by individuals who are not drivers for a TNC company. Straightforward common sense. As we began researching this issue, I was surprised to learn that the transportation network companies, a relatively new business model, are regulated very differently across states and local borders. While some states and cities, such as New York City, have implemented rules such as creating a new license category for high volume for hire services, TNCs have been mostly left to create their own policies for preventing and tracking violence or abuse to their passengers. We've all heard about the horrific reports of assault and abuse incidents involving TNC passengers and drivers. That's why our bill also requires a GAO study on the prevalence of assault and abuse perpetrated on riders by TNC drivers of ride-hailing vehicles and on TNC drivers by passengers. This data will be instrumental in determining any other safety procedures that may be necessary to ensure the safety of everyone who uses a ride-sharing app. There's no way to describe the sadness and horror and pain that Sammy's death caused her family or to her community. She lived a vibrant and loving life. She had her whole life ahead of her. She planned to study law and had hopes and dreams. We must do everything we can to prevent what happened to Sammy and from so many others from happening to anyone else. Congress now has a chance to come together and enact a change which will protect people. I believe it's our duty to do all we can to protect our constituents. I urge the entire committee, Democrats and Republicans, to work together to try and pass a bill such as this as soon as possible. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak before you, and thank you for working with us on this issue.
Thank you, Congressman Swayze. The presence of 2 members of Congress to begin this hearing only strengthens the committee's notion that something must be done. We thank you for your work, and we obviously will consider the legislation. The chairman would like to ask you a question.
I would just like to thank the gentleman. I had no idea about the signs. I just went on Amazon, and I see a very wide selection of Uber and Lyft signs, some as low as $8.99 illuminated. I figured these were trademarked, distributed by the companies, but I guess since these people are contractors, they couldn't do that. so anybody can buy one. I had no idea. Thank you. That is mind-blowing.
Well, thank you for having this hearing, Madam Chairwoman, for bringing these type of issues to light.
Certainly, thank you for that discovery during this hearing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both, and I'd like to call the witnesses, the panel in panel one now. I would like to welcome our witnesses, the mayor of the city of Gary, Indiana, and president of the National League of Cities, Karen Freeman Wilson, the director of public affairs for Commute and Enterprise, John Martz, legislative counsel at the Transportation Alliance, Paul Miller, president of the Transportation Trades Department, Afl-Cio, Larry Willis. I want to thank all of you for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony will be made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mayor Freeman, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Chair Norton. Good morning, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. I am Karen Freeman Wilson, as you know, the mayor of Gary, Indiana, and I am pleased to greet you on behalf of the citizens of Gary and the members of the National League of Cities, the nation's largest organization that represents cities, towns, and villages throughout the country. America's cities are not one size or type, but we share important commonalities. As city leaders, we love our cities and care deeply about how our policies impact residents and local businesses. And from our view, America is not doing nearly enough in our transportation networks. As a country, we have not invested in ourselves, our neighborhoods, or in the next generation of transportation solutions. Today, even the status quo is in jeopardy because of the inadequacy of revenue in the Highway Trust Fund and Mass Transit account and the looming $7.6 billion rescission of contract authority. Communities are ready to work with this subcommittee to increase the infrastructure investments that matter. We appreciate that you recognize that transportation is changing and your investment strategy should change with it. From transportation network companies to bus rapid transit to micromobility to shared cars and autonomous vehicles, the model of the future is shared, connected, and fleet-driven. Cities are the nation's test bed for transportation innovation, and we are looking to see what works and what needs to work better. TNCs are a new transit option operating in only 730 of our 19,000 cities. Fueled by investor capital, TNCs rose quickly by serving the first and last mile gap and point-to-point service. Cities had to rework our ordinances and start pilots to quickly make room for these new entrants. TNCs show how technological advances can lead to new models with the potential to combat some of society's most pressing challenges: climate issues, congestion, and connecting people of all abilities and areas. However, these ambitious businesses are not built or operated to act in the public good on their own. To achieve larger goals of equitable service, better regional service, safety outcomes, and fair wage practices, we need guiding and nimble community policy. City regulations for all new mobility entrants, including autonomous vehicles, are built to embrace the best, manage the worst, and make sure it serves residents. There are several ways Congress can support the mobility revolution and increase our connectivity. It starts with a federal focus on closing the gaps. Right now, there are enough holes in our transportation system for it to be Swiss cheese. 45% of Americans, including rural and urban underserved communities, still have no access to public transportation. The first and last mile gaps persist. TNCs are only operating in 3% of all cities. More solutions are needed. Seniors and residents with disabilities are underserved. In small towns and large cities, these residents deserve better mobility options. Regional connectivity is lacking between our growing metropolitan regions. Finally, there are severe gaps in transportation for both the unbanked and those without smartphone technology. There are 5 actions that Congress can take to improve our federal-local partnership in transportation mobility. 1, increase innovation investment and capitalize on what is happening with transportation technology. 2, ramp up research and pilots by accelerating testing, deployment, and integration of advanced transportation technologies with cities, and grow programs like the Mobility on Demand Sandbox grants and Bring Back Challenge grants. 3, allow for tailoring and collaboration by strengthening provisions for local and regional transportation decision-making as a central component of any federal program. 4, encourage data sharing as well as integrated transportation planning to manage the flow through our networks. 5, we need to prepare for automation with workforce training. Within 20 years, almost half of U.S. jobs may be at risk from automation, and there will be a disproportionate impact on African Americans and Latinos. In conclusion, we may remain excited about the innovation at our doorsteps and growing in our regions. We ask that this committee work with us to forge a bipartisan path forward and embrace emerging technology in new ways.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mayor Freeman Wilson. And we must move now to John Martz, Director of Government and Public Affairs, Commute with Enterprise.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Norton and Ranking Member Davis and Chairman Afanasio for the opportunity to present Commute with Enterprise to the committee. Again, my name is John Martz, and I'm one of the original ride sharers. Decades before the iPhone, apps, and the Internet of Things, I worked for the Chrysler Corporation. In the late 70s, during the oil embargo, we heard about this program in Minnesota. 3M was providing employees with vans to get to and from work. We at Chrysler thought this was a great idea and began talking with employers around the nation about developing similar programs. This was the beginning of ride sharing, or as we call it, van pooling. That small program in Minnesota has grown into one of the largest and fastest growing modes of public transportation in the nation. And I am here today on behalf of Commute with Enterprise. Enterprise's journey in van pooling began almost 2 decades ago when it started offering van pools in Southern California. Since then, Enterprise has become the largest van pool service provider in the nation, with 12,000 vehicles in service and more than $425 million of at-risk private capital providing public transportation. Our most successful programs are in public-private partnerships, and we currently have more than 75 such arrangements across the country. Let me briefly describe what a van pool is. Van pools are a lot like carpools, just a little bit bigger. Commuters with common work schedules and destinations ride to and from work each day in a comfortable 7 to 15 passenger van. We provide commute groups their vehicle, insurance, and maintenance to keep the van running in optimum condition. One person volunteers to be the primary driver of the van, and the participants decide the driving, routing, and other arrangements themselves, supported by our team. Typically, our customers commute each day 30 to 50 miles one way. Participants are assessed a monthly fee that is paid by the riders, their employers, or both. Commute with Enterprise provides service in rural areas, including projects at White Sands Missile Base in New Mexico, where we have more than 80 vans providing job access to 600 individuals, and in Florida, where we work with the Florida DOT to provide a job access program for rural and economically distressed communities. We also have programs in exurban and urban areas, such as the 1,340 van pools in partnership with LA County Metro. Additional case studies of our projects can be found in my written testimony, and there's about a dozen. But reducing over 1 billion passenger miles a year, our efforts put us as a top 10 transit agency when considering annual passenger miles. The only difference is we provide service across the nation rather than in just one location. Van pooling is by far the safest mode of public transportation according to the National Transit Database statistics. In addition, we are by far the most efficient mode. For example, our partnership in Gulfport, Mississippi, which by the way began as a recovery effort following Hurricane Katrina, provides the region with 60% of the passenger miles for less than 0.5% of the public subsidy of the agency. Similarly, in San Diego, California, we provide about 18% of the passenger miles in the region for just 2% of the overall public subsidy. As I mentioned, our programs work best in partnership with public agencies. Public agencies can use federal funds to create van pool programs in the same way that you can use federal funds for buses. We comply with all FTA requirements, including ADA, labor laws, and Buy America. Our vehicles are assembled in plants across the nation, including Liberty, Missouri, East Liberty, Ohio, and the south side of Chicago. We strongly believe that more can be done to encourage the use of high-performing and innovative transportation solutions like van pooling. First and foremost, we believe a new grant program should be created that provides cities, counties, and other municipal agencies with funding to utilize innovative transportation solutions, both new and old, on the condition that the service follows all applicable FTA requirements and creates new service to areas that are not served or are underserved. This program should receive separate funding from the core transit program. We believe that if a project is successful, it should then be incorporated into the region's core program of projects so long as it meets certain conditions. We're working with Congressman Scott Perry on such a proposal in hopes of providing service to the thousands of his constituents traveling more than 60 miles one way each day to work in either Baltimore, Philadelphia, or here in Washington, D.C. Also, as additional transit funding is hopefully secured in reauthorization, we believe a significant portion of any new transit dollars should be allocated through existing performance formulas to encourage agencies to look at highly efficient service options, such as van pooling and microtransit for job access, first last mile, and rural transportation needs. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martz. Paul Miller, Legislative Counsel, Transportation Alliance. We'll hear your testimony for 5 minutes.
Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, Chairman DeFazio, and members of the committee. My name is Paul Miller, and I serve as Legislative Counsel to the Transportation Alliance. The Transportation Alliance is the oldest and largest trade organization in the for-hire passenger transportation industry, with members operating over 100,000 vehicles and serving 900 million passengers per year. I applaud this committee and its leadership for holding this important hearing on transportation network companies today. I'm here today because TNCs have been dangerously careless in their approaches to safety when it comes to properly vetting drivers. The number of TNC victims are astounding. According to a story done by CNN in April of 2018, the news outlet was able to verify that 103 Uber drivers had been accused of assault or abuse. We believe the numbers are much, much higher. Between 2013 and 2018, the Transportation Alliance tracked media stories involving 395 sexual assaults at the hands of Uber and Lyft drivers. This is an epidemic, and something needs to be done. We've read the Boston Globe's chilling story 2 weeks ago of just some of the numerous women in Boston who have been sexually assaulted by Uber and Lyft drivers. As one survivor said after realizing she had been charged for a Lyft ride given by her violent attacker, quote, "They got paid for me being sexually assaulted. Lyft is profiting from this," end quote. We've seen stories of convicted felons, including murderers and registered sex offenders, who have slipped through the so-called background checks of these companies. We all know the tragedy of Samantha Josephson, which affected even the halls of this great institution. Sammy was a young college student from New Jersey. She was out with friends, decided to go home early. Samantha got into what she believed was her Uber vehicle, only to realize too late that the car she entered was fake. Unfortunately, this is a common occurrence because there are no significant marking requirements for these vehicles. Samantha never made it home because disguising oneself as a fake Uber driver is all too easy today. And who can forget the threat against your own colleague by an Uber driver who tweeted to Senator Roy Blunt, "I can't wait to shoot you in the face one by one." One can only imagine what might have happened had the senator or any elected official been unlucky enough to have been paired with this driver. These incidents can be avoided if TNCs would just adhere to one of the most rigorous but also most basic safety standard, a simple fingerprint. We believe any contractor providing for-hire transportation services paid for in full or in part by the federal government must first be required to pass a fingerprint-based national background check. It's especially important at the moment because, as we speak, the General Services Administration is in the process of putting together a request for proposal which is looking to outsource some of the federal government's transportation needs to TNCs. This must not be allowed to happen unless TNCs fingerprint every driver. TNCs like Uber and Lyft will argue fingerprint background checks are costly. They will argue fingerprint background checks discriminate against some Americans. These are simply myths. In most major cities in the United States, taxi cab drivers are required to pass fingerprint-based criminal background checks conducted by state or local authorities. And for good reason. A recent peer review study by a team of law enforcement experts, One Standard for All, found that name-based background checks are 43 times more likely to have errors than fingerprint background checks. Even the company Uber uses to run name-based checks on its drivers has acknowledged fingerprint background checks are more secure because fingerprinting helps us uncover criminal history not discovered through traditional methods, offers extra protection to aid in meeting industry guidelines, and helps prevent fraud. And most notably, in filings to the Security and Exchange Commission prior to its stock market debut this year, Uber itself acknowledged that its third-party background check process, quote, may fail to conduct such background checks adequately or disclose information that could be relevant to a determination of eligibility, end quote. It's time for action, and that action starts by requiring fingerprint background checks for anyone driving on a federally funded contract. Thank you for the opportunity today, and I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Miller. And finally, Larry Willis, who is president of the Transportation Trades Department of the Afl-Cio.
Good morning. On behalf of the Transportation Trades Department, Afl-Cio, and our 33 affiliated unions, I want to thank you, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, Chairman DeFazio, members of this subcommittee, for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. First, I would like to submit a copy of TTD's report released this morning, which urges lawmakers to hold this industry, the ride-hailing industry, accountable. My testimony today will be a summary of that report. Over the past 10 years, companies like Uber, Lyft, and Via have unquestionably grown in popularity and have radically transformed expectations for mobility and employment. As the title of this hearing suggests, they have also presented us with some new opportunities, but enormous challenges as well. As the future of this industry is debated, we cannot ignore the facts. The very feature that drives the explosive growth and popularity of the ride-hailing industry, relatively affordable and convenient service, is based on a business model that exploits workers and undermines the goals of public transportation. Meanwhile, this has been a losing equation for the industry itself. Uber and Lyft's public filings reveal that they are bleeding cash and are now desperate to find a path to profitability in other markets, including seeking financial partnerships with public transportation agencies. While we welcome opportunities to work with any partners who are advocating for innovation in public transportation, we expect those partners to subscribe to the promise of public transit. It must be equitable and accessible to all, affordable, safe, and reliable. Most importantly, any new technology or innovation in the transportation sector must not, as a key feature of its service, depend on denying workers their fundamental rights to fair wages and benefits that collective bargaining can provide. The ride-hailing industry so far has not lived up to these expectations. First, while this industry has always seen competition with public transit as a growth strategy, it is clear that they now have a more harmful agenda. They plan to go directly after federal public transportation funding to pad their losses and help prop up their unsustainable business model. Of course, we cannot stop Wall Street investors from pouring billions into these money-losing businesses. But lawmakers in this room can ensure that these same companies are not permitted to prey on public transportation and fleece the taxpayer. Second, companies like Uber, Lyft, and Via believe that their only chance to make a profit requires the suppression of worker rights and wages. As such, they try to attract drivers with the promise of high earnings, but slash take-home pay once a strong market foothold is established. Many drivers, as has been noted, make less than the minimum wage in the city that they are operating in, with some making as little as $3.75 an hour after expenses. By way of contrast, due to high union density and smart labor policies linked to federal transit funding, the average hourly wage for a bus driver is nearly $20 and as high as $40 in some cities. Third, while the federal government has invested billions into improving outcomes for congestion and air quality, the ride-hailing industry has added nearly 6 billion miles of driving annually in 9 of our largest cities. Even worse, between 20 and 50% of their driving time is without passengers in their vehicles. Fourth, unlike public transportation, ride-hailing platforms are not and never were intended to serve all users equally. In Chicago, for example, one-way trips on Lyft and Uber averaged about $15 more than the same trip on transit. Finally, we have serious concerns about the safety for drivers and passengers on these platforms. Stories like Sammy's shared this morning with us by Congressman Smith and Congressman Suozzi and others are unfortunately all too common. And other shocking reports about sexual assaults, inadequate background checks, and cover-ups of wrongdoing should give policymakers pause here. Look, our goal is not to put this industry out of business. It's not to stop innovation. On the contrary, we believe that this technology can provide real benefits for Americans. We just believe that there must be accountability to the employees, to riders, and to the aims and goals of our national transportation system. Accountability that so far just isn't there. With that said, I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Willis. We're not here to malign Uber and Lyft. There's probably not a member of this committee that hasn't, on occasion, taken an Uber or Lyft ride. But we have to do our own, we have obligations of our own to the public. Mr. Miller, you noted something that this committee can get a hold of right away when you say that the General Services Administration is, as we speak, in the process of a request for proposals looking to outsource some of the federal government's transportation needs to TNCs. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the General Services Administration has put out some requests for information and in putting together a request for proposal that would allow government workers who travel to different cities or even within the city here, instead of using a taxi or a bike or service like that, they would have contracts with TNCs that would take them to and from the locations that they need to go.
Well, you see the handle that gives the federal government right there to begin with. and as this committee will be very interested.
Well, Congresswoman, Chairwoman, that piece concerns us greatly because, again, I'm not here to say we're anti-Uber or anti-Lyft because we're not. This new opportunity with the federal government could be business for all of our companies. But when you have when the incidents that we're seeing today continue to rise and escalation of violence against passengers, just the news media today, we're here in part because we've had two congressmen come and talk about Sammy and the horrible tragedy that happened to her. What happens if that happens to a government employee? That is going to be on the front page of every newspaper, every news outlet for weeks and weeks and weeks, and those business opportunities are going to go away for all of us. So,
Well, it's the obligation of this committee to see that it doesn't happen to government employees and that it doesn't happen to the public any longer. I don't understand the difficulty in getting statistics, and this is another role Congress can play. What about law enforcement agencies? Is there is that a role for the federal government? Why is it that we do not even have good information to begin with?
I can answer that a little bit.
Mr. Miller.
If you're in a taxi cab accident or there's an incident, you have law enforcement that will show up and you will have the taxi commission, somebody representing the taxi commission there to take statements and file those types of reports. What we have today with TNCs, you don't have those types of police. The law enforcement may show up, but it's not going to be ticketed or written up as a TNC type of violation or accident because they're just regular people owning vehicles. So there is no way to distinguish what they are and who they are.
Yeah, which means that the committee has to work with law enforcement to find ways to make sure we get this information. Mr. Willis, I was interested to read that drivers on the West Coast were seeking to organize. It seems to me that that was a hopeful, move. Could you tell us more about that, please?
Well, I think what you're seeing across the board is Uber and Lyft drivers wanting some type of union representation, a union voice because of the terrible wages and benefits that we see in the
I
industry.
mean, you report as little as $3.75 an hour.
Yeah, I mean, that's, that really goes to the problem, and it goes to the issue of the independent contractor status that you raised. And in California specifically, the legislator has passed a new law that we believe will ensure that these workers are treated as employees, and that is a good path forward. There's going to be more work needs to be done, as the governor has mentioned, but I think making sure that those workers are at least are given the protections of employees and collective bargaining rights is absolutely essential. And I think the fact that Uber and Lyft, the law isn't even dried yet, the ink on the paper, and they're committing to spend $60-70 million to overturn that. So I think you see the real problem here with the way that these companies think about their drivers.
Yeah, they're terrified at organization, more terrified at organization than they are, I think, of the Congress itself. Finally, I'd like to ask Mayor Freeman Wilson about her testimony about affordability. You want to spread these, in their present state, you want to spread these to low-income communities, to the disabled? Why aren't they going into those communities in the first place?
Thank you for that question, Chair Norton. I think that in many instances, you find that there is not the opportunity to use TNCs in the community.
Well, do those communities call for TNCs? Do they dial and say, I need an Uber or Lyft? Or is it that Uber and Lyft refuses to go to those communities?
No, I don't think there's a refusal to go into our communities. I think it's the availability of people who may or may not be working for TNCs. In many instances, they require insurance, they require certain types of vehicles, and when you have communities with higher poverty levels, you just don't find those willing and able drivers that you may find in some of the larger.
Well, I don't know why drivers from more affluent communities can't go into those communities as well. I mean, if you get a call, can't you just go to the community where the call has come from?
Well, a lot of times you find that they may be 15 minutes away, And generally, when someone is looking for an Uber or Lyft, they are looking for that ride in 3 to 5 minutes.
That is certainly the
Could I
case.
add something to that, Chair?
Yes, please.
When it comes to this type of ride that you're talking about, some of the challenge becomes that the TNCs don't have the appropriate vehicles. They don't have wheelchair-accessible vehicles to pick these folks up, so that does become a challenge. In a lot of communities, taxi companies are required to have a certain percentage of their fleet wheelchair-accessible vehicles. So on the other side of the equation, TNCs don't have that same requirement.
Yeah, well, thank you for pointing that out, and I'm going to go to the ranking member now for his questions. Indeed, you point out the difference between how taxis are regulated and how these TNCs are virtually unregulated. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your testimony. Great to see some folks again. Mr. Willis, always great to work with you. Appreciate your comments. Mayor Freeman Wilson, I don't have a question for you, but I haven't spoken to my old college classmate, Darren Washington, in a while. We both graduated from Millikan University in Decatur, Illinois. I know he's active in Gary, Indiana. So if you see him, give him my best.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Mr. Martz, I do want to focus my questions on you real quick. I'm very intrigued by what your company is trying to do to kind of provide a really filling the gap between some of the ride-hailing companies and services that may be offered in urban areas that may not be offered as much in districts like mine. You know, if you could talk a little bit more, I know you gave us your testimony, just talk a little bit more about how your commute program works
Okay.
and the successes, too, of it.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of good examples. In rural areas, what we face lots of times is a need for reverse commuting to work sites that you might not necessarily put in your backyard. It might be a prison, it might be a meat processing plant, and that's one of the examples that I put in the testimony in Nebraska. Roughly an hour south of Omaha is Nebraska City, small town of 7,000 residents. Cargill has a protein plant, they call it, there. And with the flooding in Missouri that occurred in this last year, they had problems getting people to work. They called the Nebraska DOT, who we have a public-private partnership with, and we quickly sent our folks down there, explained our program, how we would work with the employees to get them to and from work. We did some analysis of their home locations and so forth, and given we knew what their work schedules were going to be. And essentially, over the course of the next 3 months, we put 30 commuter van pools in service from different areas around Omaha to an hour south of there to Nebraska City, transporting probably around 200, 220 people to and from work during a time of crisis. And the company completely embraced it. The program itself, because we provide the capital for the program, and the Nebraska DOT only provides like a $400 subsidy per month. I mean, getting into details here, but the DOT gets great leverage, essentially. We provide the capital asset on a 30-day pay-as-you-go basis. We only bill them for service that meets the standard. Essentially, it's pay for performance. And in the process, they don't have to have their capital increased to buy assets and things like that. They only pay for the subsidies, so they get 2-to-1 leverage on their dollars.
Great,
So
great.
that's an interesting rural scenario. Another one is in Florida, where we have this program.
Well, I don't have too much time left.
Okay.
I got to get to, I do have a couple other questions. I appreciate that example, but I do notice you don't have your commute program operating in the St. Louis area or right across the river in my district. Are you planning some expansion in those areas?
We'd like to. We've made several pitches to the folks in St. Louis, the transit agencies, and one of the problems that we have is the designated recipients get essentially all of the transit dollars, and it's up to them to have a desire to share those dollars, and they're not willing to do so. Now, we have a very limited amount of service in St. Louis that is not in any way subsidized, but it's very limited. Could we provide hundreds and hundreds of van pools in the St. Louis market if we had the ability to lower our rates just even a third? Absolutely. This is what happened in Los Angeles or even in El Paso or Dallas or Houston. where our rates are just lowered 30 to 40%, and instead of 200 vans, we'll have 800 vans in service. So just a little bit of assistance makes a huge deal. But St. Louis is a great example. Right here in D.C. is another one, which WMATA has never agreed to want to share those dollars.
Okay.
Every mile, essentially, that we would operate would contribute 50 cents towards the formula program. So there are transit agencies that we operate with, but even in those agencies, they don't share a significant amount to grow the program even more.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Martz. Mr. Willis, you know, some of the TNCs have introduced some safety measures already. You know, ability to text 911 through the rideshare app and reminding them to check the license plate number before entering a vehicle. Can you tell us, in your opinion, how can the taxi and limo industry keep up with technological advances like that too? Or any of you guys, Mr. Miller?
I can answer that. We do it today. I mean, the myth is that only Uber and Lyft are using technology. I mean, every company that is respectably having a legitimate business out there in the for-hire transportation industry are using apps today. We're not global like Uber and Lyft, but our members have apps very similar to the same platforms that Uber and Lyft have for their very own company. So they do have that. And what you will see in some of the taxis right now, you will have the public displays in the back, and it will give you a button if you are feeling threatened or somehow you can push a button and emergency will be called for you privately. It's a private button or panic button type of thing.
All right, thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Miller, this weird thing about fingerprint background checks would be discriminatory. I mean, I know they would be discriminatory against, you know, murderers and, you know, convicted rapists, but what other than that is the basis for this discrimination?
There's feeling from some that if you have any kind of criminal background that you won't be able to drive. Say if you were 18 years old and you had a minor drug offense.
Well, no, I just looked at the Uber conditions. They say even certain felony offenses will be permitted. They don't even mention misdemeanors. And they say, you know, they list certain driving offenses. So why wouldn't they really want to know about that stuff as opposed to conducting a fake, you know, insufficient background check just by name basis?
I cannot answer that for them, but I can just tell you that the thing about discrimination is really more of a myth.
Right.
Just by having some sort of offense in your background is not going to necessarily prohibit you from driving for any company.
They set the conditions, and I just looked because they said, how can I become an Uber driver? I just looked at the list of conditions and say certain felonies are allowed, and I'm okay with non-violent. I'm okay, you know, yeah, that's fine. So they set those conditions, but they specifically exclude murderers and sexual predators, who they approved in Eugene, Oregon, with their background check. Now, did they really spend $10 million in one city to oppose fingerprint-based background? That can't be.
That is correct.
That's got to be inaccurate.
No, that is actually
How do we know that number?
because that comes from the folks back in those communities who were tracking it, both on the labor side and on the business side.
$10 million. I just figured out if a background check costs $60, fingerprint-based, that would be 170,000 or so background checks. How many Uber drivers do they have down there? 1 million?
A lot.
So I mean, this is incredible. I'm so angry that they wouldn't show up today, but thank you. I learned in the first hearing, and I went online, that I could be a fake Lyft driver tomorrow for $8.99 with Prime delivered.
Yeah.
And I learned from you that GSA is soliciting these people, yet we're going to put, you know, public employees into systems where the workers are being abused, as has been talked about here. Some people earning as little as less than $4 an hour after expenses, and where their safety could be at risk. We can deal with that.
Well, what makes this even worse, Mr. Chairman, is that I gave Mr. Smith an article that comes from Uber drivers themselves who are taunting and saying that you don't even need to get a background check. Here's how you cheat the system by doing that. It's just flaunting it. And again, in their
Well, I would love to have that document.
I will get that to you.
Committee's
and
been
several
through
others.
things like this before, drug testing and alcohol testing for truck drivers with things called Whizinators to get around the system. We've been down this, I would love to have that document.
I will get
Yes,
that
Mr.
to you right
Willis.
after this hearing.
You know, Mr. Chairman, you pointed it out. You know, this committee has mandated background checks for transportation workers across the board, including truck drivers that happen to need a hazmat endorsement, have to get a fingerprint background check that, quite frankly, is pretty extensive. So I think there is, you know, significant, you know, precedent here, and you've done this for, again, other areas in the transportation space.
And we have certain rules, I can't remember with truck drivers, but I know with longshore people, we've set the standards on what past offenses and what time lapse. But we're not saying, gee, if you ever had a felony, you
Correct.
can't do this, but
And there's a waiver process that we fought very hard for to make sure that even if you did commit an offense, you have an ability to demonstrate that you're not a security, in this case, a safety risk, that may allow you to still work in that profession. So there are some due process protections built into that.
And the government also does require drivers who drop things off at military bases and other secure facilities to require their drivers to be fingerprint background checked as well, and they do it as a cost of business.
And, okay, I think we've covered that. Thank you, Madam Chair, appreciate it.
And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for laying out that almost everybody else who drives the public has to have fingerprints and a background check except these people. We got to do something about that. Mr. Babin?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair, and very, very interesting and very good hearing. I would say thank you very much for you all coming in to giving your testimony as well. I also want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Smith and Swazi, who shared their testimony in the first panel on their rideshare passenger protection bill, which I plan to co-sponsor. And I, too, am disappointed that we were not able to ask questions of Uber and Lyft. But my first question is for the panel here. I represent a large part of southeast Texas, and while my district includes the heavily populated Houston area, it is mostly made up of rural and widely spread out communities. The majority of my constituents do not have access to a robust transit system like others in more densely populated areas have. I've seen studies that show that access to reliable transportation can greatly improve the health of senior citizens and those who receive medical treatments in which it is not safe for patients to drive themselves to and from, such as dialysis and chemotherapy. With that, I'm very concerned that Americans who live in districts like mine are all across this country and who are in dire need of access to transportation and the problems that they have. But very quickly, if each of you can share what your organizations are doing to ensure that services are available to people who live or work in sparse transportation and underserved areas. And I would start with you, Mayor, if you would tell me what some of those are.
Thank you, Mr. Babin.
Yes, ma'am.
NLC represents communities that have as few as 500 people and as large as New York City. We believe that one of the ways that Congress can impact this phenomenon that you describe is through the Metropolitan Planning Councils. In our own Metropolitan Planning Council in Northwest Indiana, it's called NERPC, we're able to work together with large cities and small towns to ensure that there is equitable funding, equitable access for citizens, and that there is, in fact, a regional transit authority. And we believe that the funding and the encouragement that Congress gives to make sure that we work together in that manner has an impact, and NLC certainly supports those networks.
Great, thank you. Mr. Martz.
Interesting, in your particular district, we're focused on work commutes, you know, more so than the other trips. But there are instances in your district, whether it's, example would be groups of commuters going from, let's say, Woodville to Beaumont, or from, let's say, Livingston to the airport in Houston, that there just really isn't an entity that is there to help facilitate funding for those other than TxDOT, and they don't necessarily view themselves as operational. The mobile plant just west of Beaumont would be one that doesn't really fall in Houston Metro's jurisdiction, who has a program, but Beaumont Transit could do this type of program, but they've chosen not to over the years because we've approached them on several occasions.
Yeah, well, you know your stuff. I can see that in my district as well.
All my wife's family is from Beaumont.
No kidding, that's my hometown. All right, thank you very much. Mr. Miller.
Let me echo first, I echo the comments made by the mayor, but also, it's been a challenge for us. I will say we are doing better at it, but it still continues to be a challenge, and partly because you have two set of rules. You have a new set of entrants who've really come into the market in 2010 with 0 rules and regulations, and then you have another set of operators who have overabundant rules and regulations. So just take the insurance, for example. For a taxi cab, insurance is about $5,000 per vehicle per year. For an Uber or Lyft, it's probably a couple $100s. So you're talking about a huge cost on the one hand and 0 cost on the other. So if we could truly, really try to level that playing field out, I think some of this sorts itself out through that. Pricing is another issue. I mean, in some of those communities, you may get surge pricing on the TNC side. On the taxi side, you don't have that. It is a regulated price fee structure.
Absolutely, thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Willis.
You know, look, we see real value in expanding, transportation services here. But, I would remind the committee that, the reason that TNCs may be attractive in some settings is because no one is really paying the full cost of the service, right? It's being subsidized by investors. The drivers are absorbing many of these costs. And what we should be focused on is finding ways to encourage creativity and innovation within public transit agencies. I think that's going to require more money and more support from this committee. But I think within the public transit framework, even in rural areas, is where we can grow these services.
Okay, thank you. And I'll go ahead and yield back there, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and thanks to all of our witnesses. I'm really disappointed that Uber and Lyft are not here, because my questions that I had when I came to this hearing would have been directed. I'm from a very large urban area where we have spent lots of time planning public transit, and with our rapid transit system supplemented by buses. But we also have large pockets of people where we have at least 3 sizable rehabilitation programs for ex-offenders. And in my state, an ex-offender cannot get a driver's license, nor a state ID, which is a real problem. When they get through the rehabilitation, they got to find jobs, but they don't have a way to get there. And so maybe perhaps you have some ideas other than supplementing the public transit system with services like Lyft or Uber. But that is a major problem in many urban areas, and especially in large urban areas where you have a concentration of the job opportunities, a distance from where many of the disadvantaged people have to go. So if you could comment on how we could address that issue without some type of temporary or supplemental transportation services, I would appreciate it.
Ms. Johnson, I can certainly address how we've done that in Gary and other communities. We, too, share your challenge in terms of having a large number of former offenders who are required and who desire, quite frankly, to work. One of the partnerships that we've developed with UPS, actually in Illinois, is we provide vans for them to work, and they travel about 40 miles from Gary every day. We provide 2 shifts of vans, and we have partnered with UPS to ensure that certain offenses won't prevent people from being able to work in those jobs. I think what that demonstrates is that cities are always focused on trying to ensure that every resident has an opportunity to realize their greatest dreams and to support their families and do the things that we all want to do.
Ms. Johnson, in Dallas and Fort Worth and Denton County, we have 3 different public-private partnerships. We provide about 300 commuter van pools between the two, and the Dallas program is about 175, I think. It's been financially constrained a little bit, which is kind of surprising given the market that's there. There's room for many more. But your agencies, I don't think, are necessarily the problems. There are so many others around the country that don't really view what we do, for example, which is a lot of reverse commute type stuff or suburb to suburb commuting, as something that they really do or want to do. They're very set in their ways, and this is our route system. This has always been our route system. It's not going to change very much, and we don't have enough money to operate what we've got, so we don't even look at things. And that we run into this all the time. So we work cooperatively with your folks in the Dallas market, and but we think there's still more opportunity there to do more.
And I will just say from our perspective, because we are independent contractors, it's going to be up to each individual company or individual driver. And I think some of that, there needs to be more sophistication. There needs to be more business savvy looking at these types of opportunities that they need. They may not know that they exist. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we have in some of these areas.
I would only add, that one of the great benefits of public transit, as I mentioned in my opening statement, is that, by law and by practice, it is accessible to all, or should be accessible to all. To the degree that TNCs want to pretend to be public transit providers and seek federal subsidies, they need to be held to that same standard as well. So again, I think a lot of the mobility on demand, the new innovation of transportation services can be done in the public transit context, but to the degree that you're using these outside entities, we have to hold them to the same standards that we require of public transit.
Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Lamalfa.
Thank you, Chair Norton, for having this hearing today on this increasingly important topic. Appreciate it. As a Californian, I do note that last month Governor Newsom did sign a bill called AB 5 into law, which is going to force most of the rideshare companies in a district like mine to lay off their drivers, as well as the effects on independent truckers and basically a lot of the lifeblood for rural California and rural living. Now, some might on the left flank of our Democrat colleagues might cheer this on because their urban constituents won't really feel the effect of this law. They make enough money as full-time employees in urban areas to make it work. But again, in a district like mine, in rural areas, mountainous areas, Northern California, this law will decrease the commercial services available to the elderly, disabled, those with medical visits that cannot drive themselves, and those that are likely to be picked up for DUIs if they drive themselves. Something I really thought we all agreed was a bad thing. According to data provided by Lyft in my own district, they average 24,000 rides per month from around 1,000 drivers. Just under 2/3 of those rides start in low-income areas that might not have the easy access to public transportation. Now, transit doesn't have 24-hour models in a lot of areas, even here. Or there might be a very long hike to get to public transit. So when you look at that, just 10% of that would be 2,400 rides per month, which happen late at night for those that might be under the influence. So you can look at the data however you want. Lyft alone is taking probably 2,400 maybe drunk drivers or drowsy drivers off the road every month in my own district. So the governors effectively, and the legislature has effectively banned my constituents from making a choice. Choice for these consumers and choice for the drivers themselves that don't want to be employees, rather be independent, have their own business. Who's against that? Evidently people in this room, people on this panel, would have them all rather be corralled into a situation that doesn't suit them. but the typical norm. You can call a taxi in many places. Maybe people don't, and maybe as riders, we don't always want that choice. I noticed that the Uber and Lyft vehicles are a little cleaner, a little nicer, and a little more available a lot of times. So what we see again in my district, 88% of the drivers in NorCal were part-time, driving on the side to earn a little extra money. There will not be 1,000 new taxi drivers in Chico and Redding on January 1 when this law kicks in California. But on that particular day, January 1, how many more drivers will there be? So a question for Mr. Martz and Mayor Freeman Wilson. This committee spent a few months talking about this concept of mobility on demand. We've had committee hearings and a roundtable. Even Chairwoman Norton has talked about her interest in helping with working with me to set up something in the very rural areas of the U.S., such as what we're talking about with medical visits and for our veterans. How can van pooling, again, Mr. Martz and Ms. Freeman Wilson, or some next day service be adopted to work for the elderly, disabled, and our veterans who have trouble attending their medical appointments, getting groceries, or even traveling to community events? What do you see as being feasible for those?
We believe that there is an opportunity for cities and localities, cities, towns, and villages, quite frankly, to work with senior organizations, to work with those organizations that serve our disabled residents, to provide opportunities for partnership. I think the thing that mayors and, quite frankly, council members bring to the table is the ability to convene folks from localities. But at the same time, Mr. LaMalfa, we're not looking for a ban on Uber and Lyft. All we're saying is that in instances where there are safety challenges, that there is room for background checks, for other opportunities to ensure.
My time is short. I appreciate that. And there's good things they're talking about in the bill with that, but it sounds like there's a big push to really eviscerate those services, and that we've had these some of these programs in rural counties, and you see that either they're riding around empty at the wrong times of day, or not available and not feasible, sustainable financially. So my time has already expired, but I appreciate that, and I hope we can continue this in that not everything that gets passed in Sacramento, such as AB 5, which will gig a lot of the economy, as they call it, the gig on trucking and personal services like this, but that we can have more flexibility for many of our rural needs for areas that just can't afford all these. So I appreciate it, Madam Chair, and I'll get back.
And I appreciate those remarks. We're trying to make these rides safe, and we're trying to make them more equitable across the country. And I am concerned. I think what's happening in rural communities is exactly like the question I asked the mayor about happening in low-income communities here. So that if these rides are going to be out there, we with all of the safety problems they have, which Congressmen must take leadership in correcting, we also got to make sure that they are more widely available where they're most needed. So I appreciate that line of questions. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witnesses. An extremely important hearing. We've had a lot of discussion about the safety issues, ways in which that can be dealt with, fingerprints and the like, and certainly we must move forward with that particular piece, and I suggest it be at the federal level. I want to go back to AB 5, the California legislation, which has been bounced around here several times. Mr. Willis, why don't we start with you? Can you give us a rundown on exactly what is in it and why it was important enough to become the law in California?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I have to respond in part to your colleague. The idea that Uber and Lyft drivers are somehow their own businesses is laughable. These are drivers that in many cases are making below minimum wage in the cities to which they are driving. As I cited in my testimony, it can go as low as $3.75 after you back out expenses. The idea that they should be covered by minimum wage laws, other worker protection laws that California and other states affords their employees, we think is a matter of basic fairness. You know, one of the problems when employers misclassify their workers as independent contractors is they gain a competitive advantage by other companies that follow the rules. And that's what we're seeing in the transit space. We have people walking away from transit in cases to go use TNCs, but only because those services are cheaper, because those companies aren't abiding by their obligations to treat their workers and to classify their workers in the right way. So I think AB 5 is a very good step in that direction. It is a codification and a clarification of a Supreme Court decision in your state, a unanimous decision, I should note. So, you know, again, we think that's a good first step, and to at least give these workers the basic rights that employees, which we believe they are, should have. I'm sorry, go ahead.
We really need to understand the difference between an independent contractor and an employee to fully comprehend why AB 5 was necessary. Could you elaborate on that fundamental issue as quickly as possible?
Sure. Look, a independent contractor, in a sense, is an independent business and don't need the same type of minimum wage protections, worker compensation protections, benefit protections that a frontline employee does. The idea that's been raised here that just because someone is a part-time driver, that they shouldn't be afforded the rights as employees. There's a lot of part-time workers here that are employees. Those two things are not inconsistent. So again, I think it's an important distinction.
We really need to understand as a committee, and we haven't really gotten into this in detail yet, but we may need to do so to really write decent legislation here. An independent contractor, an independent business contractor versus an employee. It really comes down to who controls the time and the job itself.
Correct.
And in the case of Uber and Lyft, it's been determined in California very clearly by the Supreme Court and court cases that it is the company, Uber and Lyft, that control the timing, the availability, or the access to the work. We need to understand that. With that in mind, there are many other issues that are critical to the employee. A tax collection, workers' compensation, insurance, automobile insurance, liability insurance, and other things that are in play in this relationship. We need to go into it in detail. I frankly think AB 5 was the right thing to do in clarifying the difference between independent and employee, which is what it does. Yes. It certainly affects Uber and Lyft. It does affect others. But my own experience at this on the insurance side is that it's an extremely important step forward in clarifying these matters. And for us right now, we do have in play, I think, a very important matter, and that is the background check on the driver, which is one of the issues that's been raised here. Also, that we ought to have greater clarity at the national level, the difference between an employee and an independent contractor. I'll let it go at that. Mr. Willis, I'm out of time, but I'd like to urge the committee to really hone in on this very, very important matter. Use California, the court case in California, and the law that follows and implements that court case.
I think the lead that California has done here with AB 5 is absolutely tremendous, and I think your comments in support of that, I think, are right on. So thank you for that.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. This distinction between an employee and a contractor is stymied this Congress now for some time. But I think we all can agree that whether you're an independent contractor or an employee, if you serve the public, safety should come first. Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this meeting here today. This is a question for Mr. Martz. When we think about rural communities, transportation to and from work is always an issue of utmost importance. In a growing competitive economic environment, companies are looking at every possible factor when deciding where to expand, when and where to open new facilities and break ground on new projects. When Amazon, for example, was deciding where to put their headquarters, one of their factors of consideration was ease of transportation for work commutes. In my rural district of Minnesota, the vast majority of people travel to and from work by personal vehicle. When a district the size of West Virginia, you can imagine that these folks sometimes have to travel 60 miles to and from work. And when commutes are that long, you can also imagine that putting in a subway system or expanding access to electric scooters in rural Minnesota wouldn't really cut it. So how can commuter van pool programs fill a needed gap in our transportation system in rural communities, and how are they providing cost-effective job access in rural settings?
Okay. For example, in your district, I would say one of the bigger employers would be the mining companies outside of Duluth. We don't do a lot in your district today, but we do a lot with mining companies of other areas, in Victor Valley, in California, and in Phoenix, and Tucson, and areas like that, where they do borax mining and copper and so forth mining. But what happens is a lot of these facilities that are outside the urban areas that employ several hundred people, for example, the local town generally might have, like in the case I used, Nebraska City, 7,000 residents. You're not going to fill all those jobs from those people. So the next town, which might be 50 miles away, would be a next source for employment for those people. And that's our bread and butter. If we can get those employers to work with us to find the prospective employees, we can put service into those areas in that fashion. And that's what we do. That's every day we do that stuff. There are probably situations where in your district folks travel from maybe like Cambridge to St. Paul, which is a pretty good hike. It's a little bit outside the Metro's service area, but that's not an unusual trip for us. But that's the kind of thing that we do all the time.
Thank you. And I will say that I just want to make a note who these Uber drivers are, which I think is important to frame this hearing by. Many of these drivers are immigrants, middle-class parents taking on a second job, students saving for college, and maybe a retiree making some spending money. This committee must be mindful of these drivers, these hard workers, while we legislate. Because the worst law is one of the unintended consequences, and it would be extremely unfortunate if we took action that limited these populations' ability to participate in this industry. And my last comment to this committee and Madam Chair, I don't necessarily think that this committee should blindly follow the state of California. My state of Minnesota is much different than the state of California. It's much more rural. And I think we have to have a broader look at this issue and the transportation network companies and how we can serve not only urban and metro, but rural communities. Mr. Martz, I'll give you the last minute.
Well, and there's very differing business models that we've presented today, too. And one of my concerns with this is, the possibility of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What we do has an extraordinary safety history, extremely efficient, and we work very closely with the transit agencies that are willing to partner with us, and DOTs and MPOs. So we'd like to do more, but we just that's one of the reasons why we're here, is so that we don't get thrown out in the process.
And I think that I just want to echo, Madam Chair, you talked about safety being the number one priority. I couldn't agree with you more, and I appreciate that comment. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albert. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mayor Freeman Wilson, as mayor, I know that concerns about transit access and equity matter a great deal to you. Though the presence of TNCs has skyrocketed in major metropolitan areas, more rural and suburban areas haven't seen the same availability of ride-hailing services. At this time, do you think these ride-hailing services have helped or further exacerbated the issue of transit equity?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. That's certainly a question and a concern that we have in local communities. I think that there is an opportunity there, given what the statistics have shown, given what we have seen to date, for our local mayors and council members to join with members of Congress to sit down with Uber, Lyft, Via, those provider of ride-sharing services, to ensure their commitment to equity, to their commitment to providing a more robust opportunities in communities, both urban and rural, that have seen chances.
Thank you. Now, I'm concerned about the ride-hailing services' dependence on forced arbitration clauses in the terms of service of their agreements. And what might happen is some person, older person, wanting to be hip and cool like everybody else, and maybe they, the car is in for repairs, and the children have told them, why don't, instead of calling the cab, that's just so old school, why don't you call the ride-hailing company? And so the person goes onto their app on their phone proudly, goes to the App Store, downloads the app, and scrolls all the way down to the box where it says, I agree to these terms. And so they click that box, and they order a driver. The driver arrives. It's in a beautiful neighborhood. It's clearly the person has money. And they jump in the car. Driver hits the child lock button so that they can't get out. Driver just happens to be recently released on parole from the maximum security state pen where he served 30 years for murder. And he's out now, driving a ride-hailing car, pulls around, picks up his buddy, or maybe the buddy was in the car to begin with, and they start leaning on you, telling you that, look, I need to get $5,000. Let me have your bank card and your PIN number. And then they go ahead and get your money out of the bank. And then the driver pulls out into the street, so excited that he's got the money, and bam, he gets hit by a Mack truck. He's failed to yield the right of way. Everybody dies. And then your next of kin seek to sue to recover for the loss of your life, and only to find out in horror that you have agreed to a forced arbitration clause that prohibits your next of kin from taking the ride-hailing company, which is negligent in many respects, to court for a trial by jury and forces it into an arbitration context. Mr. Miller, have you had any experience with that happening?
We have not. We don't have those types of clauses in our contract or our apps. It's if you want to sign up, you sign up and you download it. It's a local ride. So, yeah, we do not have those types of clauses.
I've heard that the major ride-hailing companies, who shall remain nameless, but they've been named repeatedly and they're not here today, they refuse to come, they have these terms of services, they have these agreements in their term of services, these clauses. You know anything about it, Mr. Willis?
Well, look, I think it's a great example of these companies, trying to, not follow what other providers, have to follow here, and this sort of attitude that they're beyond these type of regulations, these type of oversights, this type of legal responsibility that other providers, whether they're taxi cabs or transit, or other transportation services. So I think, it raises another good example of the problems here that we need to think about.
Why do you think they include those clauses in their terms of agreement?
Because I think it's financially advantageous for them, and I think they can get away with it, and no one's really holding them accountable. And I think this committee and other policymakers need to do that, especially if these companies want to go, again, play and be a part of the public transit network and framework, issues like this just cannot be tolerated.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton, and thank you all for being here today. Transportation network companies have dramatically changed the way people get around in my community. From initiatives to make sure that students at Marshall University can get home safely after a night out or a football game, to expanding access for my district's older and disabled residents who leave the house or have to attend a non-emergency medical visit. Ride-sharing serves them all. Ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft have become an essential part of my rural community, one that typically relies on personal vehicles for transit. Without a large taxi community or reliable public transportation, ride-sharing has played an important role in lowering impaired driving accidents and expanding access to services for underserved communities. Mr. Willis, I worry that reclassifying ride-sharing drivers as employees will eliminate many of the benefits that the transportation network companies provide for my constituents. Currently, someone from my district can reliably hail a ride in about 6 minutes from one of over 500 drivers who are working for a ride-sharing company. Most of the drivers in my district only drive part-time to earn extra money on top of their full-time job. And I worry that reclassifying contractors will take away the flexibility the drivers rely on to drive when they're not at their main job, and will drastically increase the time riders will need to wait for a ride, and in turn could also lead to a return to pre-ride sharing levels of accidents occurring while driving under the influence, since ride sharing will be less convenient and available. Do you have data that would say otherwise, and that the reclassification of contractors would not negatively impact both drivers and riders?
Well, look, as I said in my opening statement, and we submitted a report to this committee, we are not opposed to these services. We think mobility on demand has a lot of potential, but we reject the notion that just because you're offering innovation in this space, because you are providing a service that you can do it by misclassifying your drivers as independent contractors when you look at the laws, especially now in California and I think in other states, that they should be classified as employees. And as I said earlier, we categorically reject the notion that just because a driver is a part-time driver, I don't understand how that makes them an independent contractor. We have a lot of part-time workers in this country who are and correctly are treated as employees. And I think a union contract, I think employee status can be done in a way to provide the flexibility that I think you're looking for.
Well, I was looking for some data. Mayor Freeman Wilson, many TNCs have partnered with cities and communities to show riders that the most efficient way to get to their destination is by using a combination of ride sharing and public transit. In rural areas, having access to mass transit options can be extremely limited. How do we continue to promote increasing options for consumers instead of limiting them? Do you have recommendations as to how Congress can work with the state or on local levels to increase options for our constituents?
Thank you, Ms. Miller, for that question. We absolutely do have recommendations. We believe that one of the ways that can happen is by convening roundtables, as an example, with local communities, both rural and urban, to sit down with TNCs. We believe that your experience in your rural area in West Virginia is quite frankly unusual. We have TNCs in only 730 of our 19,000 cities, towns, and villages. And so we think there's room for growth, but we know that Congress has to step in to ensure that that growth occurs in a fair, safe, and equitable manner.
Well, our idea of urban's more like 55,000 people.
I understand.
Mr. Miller, How has the taxi industry expanded from urban to rural areas? Can taxis fulfill the needs of rural communities while providing the same convenience that the TNCs are providing now?
Yeah, I think it's a myth to think that taxis can't do the same, provide the same types of service as Uber and Lyft. Again, everybody's using apps today. So yes, we do have the same types of platforms. Again, the difference being we're not global. We are local, in your community types of providers. So yes, we can do that. I think the industry as a whole needs to do better in rural communities. But again, when you have a playing field that's stacked so far on one side that where you don't have many regulations, and on the other side you have more regulations, it's hard to do business. We need to find a way to level that playing field so everybody has the same opportunities, not just giving the carve-outs and the advantages to one side versus the other just because they're new entrants. We're all taxi companies. I mean, I hear a lot about how this is Uber and Lyft are technology companies. They're not. Everybody's using an app today. If using an app constituted you being a technology company, every business in this country would be. Pepsi, Coke, everybody who has an app. You can get fast food on delivery and things of that nature. So it is. Let's call it what it is. We're all taxi. We're all for higher transportation services. And we can all do a better job, but we have to level the playing field. And this myth that only Uber and Lyft have this fancy new technology, they don't. We all have it.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miller. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing, and to the panelists, thank you. This has been very interesting. My question is to the mayor, Mayor Freeman Wilson. You have mentioned how some cities are partnering with TNCs to expand transit options, either in areas that lack rail or bus transit, or to serve workers that need to commute late at night. There are these arrangements or these relationships or partnerships. Can you give us a little bit more detail? How are these partnerships initiated? Are they new services, or do they replace services that may have been provided by an infrequent bus or dial-a-ride service? Are we talking about something new, or are we talking about replacement of existing services when they develop? And how do the partner? How do they come together?
Mr. Lowenthal, thank you for that question. What we found is that because of the need, because transit stops at certain times in most community, because transit doesn't go everywhere, that there is an opportunity for unique partnership. Those partnerships are generally initiated by mayors, by someone who works at the direction of the mayor, by regional transit agencies, and certainly by our regional planning commissions. What I'd like to do is get you some specific examples of that, because I think that this will help the committee as you develop this legislation, so we can provide that from NLC staff.
Mr. Willis, my question is, in terms of these partnerships that are developing, how would you like to see cities and transit agencies come together? What are some of the critical issues? You've already indicated this, but now when cities are initiating or transit agencies are seeking out, what should they be looking for?
In the TNC space, or?
In the TNC space.
Look, as we've discussed here, and I think this is why we want to be a part of this discussion, these entities have to agree to create a service that is like public transit. They have to treat their workers in the right way. They have to provide a safe service that's been discussed a lot here. It has to be equitable and accessible to all communities, a standard that I don't think exists here. And again, on the worker side, the insistence of the TNC industry to misclassify their workers drives down those wages. We think that runs counter to the promise of public transit, which creates a lot of good jobs in our communities, that supports other workers to get to their place of employment. So public transit binds our communities together. And until the Uber and Lyfts and Vias of the world can figure out a way to, operate more, treat their workers in the right way, provide this same level of service, we don't think they should be part of that public transit mix.
Thank you. The next question is back to Mayor Freeman Wilson. As I understand, and we've talked about a little bit, TNC rides are heavily subsidized by investors. Is that not so today? So how do cities manage this risk that a TNC partner may have to scale back increases or increase prices? We now have California's AB5, and really looking at the role, and the existing model may not be able to sustain itself the way it is now. Do cities deal with this risk that all of a sudden it could go away, or what are some of the concerns that cities would assume? Do they assume risk in developing partnerships?
I'm sorry,
I'm just wondering about the risk that a city assumes if they develop a relationship with the TNCs, and we know that these ride sharing or TNCs are heavily subsidized now. We know that they're not making money. I just want to know what risks cities are assuming by offering these kinds of services or these partnerships. Are there risks that go along with this, and who assumes those risks?
So I would say that there is not an assumption of risk. I think that it more speaks to the responsibility that we have as local leaders to ensure certain things for our citizens. And the best way to ensure that is through communication. Communication alone doesn't ensure that risk. Even regulation, like our colleagues have done in Eugene, Oregon, doesn't assume a risk. It simply speaks to the responsibility that we have.
Anybody else want to assume? Is there going to be risk involved in this?
Could I answer that as well?
Yes.
Congressman, I think the federal government's going to find out very quickly whether or not it's going to have risk. I mean, if GSA does go forward and contract with TNCs for these services, the question has to be asked, that final bid or quote that they give you, is that going to be something they're going to be able to come back and change and say, we can't make money on this? As soon as the investors say, we want to see profits in these areas, are they going to now come to the federal government and say, we now have to increase prices here because we can't sustain the subsidy that we're giving to our drivers now? You're going to find out very quickly whether or not that happens.
Well, I'm glad we're at least discussing that issue. Yes?
And in our case, which is a little different, we provide the vehicles. We assume all the risk financially. There's no risk to transit agencies, cities, counties, and on insurance as well. We completely insure and indemnify the contract sponsors. So it's a little bit different model altogether, but there is assumption of the risk on the part of the private sector on our particular services, and I want to make that clear. The other thing, though, is that cities and counties, you're bringing this up.
Thank you very much. Your time has expired.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to go back to the testimony and the legislation that's being proposed by two other members, and I'm going to personally take a look at that because obviously, every rider, every user of any form of transportation should be able to feel safe when they enter a vehicle, whether it's a Uber driver, Lyft driver, train, transit, taxi, whoever it may be. And so I do think it is, we need to look at ensuring that we're adequately doing what we can to ensure that the drivers are protected. Unfortunately, I should say, in my district, I'm not aware of any specific incidents where an Uber or Lyft driver have been involved in an assault, and certainly no murder. I do want to read, though, a headline from about a year ago, which I vividly remember, and it says, Lancaster City taxi driver charged with raping woman after dropping her off at her home. And in this specific situation, the driver of the taxi offered to take the woman's luggage into the home for her and ended up raping her. How do you think that happened, Mr. Miller?
How do I think it happened?
Yeah, what happened in the system to allow a taxi driver to do that?
It clearly fell through the cracks. I don't know the specific article you're talking, but it happens on all sides. I'm not here to bash Uber and Lyft because we have TNCs within our membership as well.
I know I've talked to many Uber and Lyft drivers in my district who are grateful for the opportunity for maybe a part-time job or something of that sort, and none of them have assaulted anyone, none of them have murdered anyone. So the idea that I've heard in this hearing today, bashing all Uber and Lyft drivers due to the criminality and the horrific crimes of a few of them is insulting.
Mr. Congressman,
do you think the taxi driver in Lancaster City would have been required to have been fingerprinted?
They should have been, and that's why I'm here today. We are pushing for everybody to.
I'd actually like to have more information on that. I'd like to have more information on specific statistics on taxi drivers and how many have been involved in an assault
That's one reason I think why we're all here today.
Yeah,
is we would
so
like to find a way to track all this.
I'm going to submit it to the record, some questions along this line that I'd like you to answer. I do also want to ask Mr. Miller, the ride sharing, the idea, the benefit of what Uber and Lyft have been providing in my district to folks who do not have access. We don't have a lot of taxi drivers in our area. Why is it that those ideas have not, don't you think are long overdue, and why weren't they developed by the taxi and limousine drivers industry?
Are you talking about just the TNC model itself?
Yes.
Again, it's a business that has been around for hundreds of years, and they've been doing things the same way. Again, competition is not a bad thing. Uber and Lyft found a new model and something that appealed to consumers. We are all doing it now. Again, the difference being now, if we have some of our members who have traditional taxi companies, but also have divisions of the TNC model themselves. It's harder for us, for some reason, in localities to get approved for a TNC model.
You mentioned the regulation. You specifically mentioned that taxi drivers today, by regulation, are not allowed to provide congestion pricing.
Correct.
Is that true?
Correct.
Would you support us removing that regulation?
I think I'd have to go back, but I would eventually guess if you polled our drivers, they probably would say yes.
You and the association would support that position?
I can't answer for them right now, but I'd take it back to them and get you an answer for that.
You did. I can relate to the situation you're in where you're heavily regulated and a new disruptive model really is impacting, and you're potentially looking for barriers to entry or at least leveling the playing field. You've said multiple times you'd like to see the playing field leveled.
Absolutely.
I think the free market has driven this kind of innovation. What regulations would you support removing on your current taxi drivers and limousines?
I would be happy to get that from the leadership and get you a direct answer to that. I just don't have all the way to answer that today without vetting it through them, but we have.
Do you have one regulation that you would support removing?
I think the insurance. Right now, we have a higher standard for getting insurance than they do. We would like to see us be able to qualify for that hybrid type of insurance because, again, you're talking about a $5,000 a year cost versus a...
I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry. I'd love to have more of this discussion. In fact, I'll submit a question in that regard as well.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear from you what regulations you would like to see removed.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Smoker, if you submit the question to the chair, we will make sure it goes to Mr. Miller. Thank you. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just start by saying how disappointed I am that Uber and Lyft felt they could not come today to be part of this hearing. I think it was a real loss of an opportunity, and it's really unfortunate. Let me just say that before I came to Congress, I served as a county supervisor. So I know firsthand how TNCs work in our communities, the benefit they provide, but the challenges and the cons. And I know those issues firsthand. And in my community, in my district, there's been public safety incidents that have dealt with Uber, Lyft, and even taxis. And I think there's a lot to discuss and explore how we can make TNCs work better for everyone. Mayor Freeman Wilson, thank you for being here. In particular, I share your local government service. And in your testimony, you cite some compelling statistics regarding our workforce. There are roughly 53 million freelance workers today, comprising 34% of our total U.S. workforce. Uber and Lyft employ nearly 3.5 million of those workers in the United States. As we look at the future of self-driving cars and improvements in automation, what are recommendations we should look at in terms of preparing our workforce towards this shift?
Thank you, Mr. Carbajal, and thank you for your comments about my service. We are gravely concerned that over the next 20 years, there may very well be a drastic reduction, if not an elimination, of those who currently work for Uber and Lyft and similar companies. And we believe that the federal government and Congress can be a significant partner in terms of workforce development, retooling those skills of those workers to participate in new technology.
Thank you. Let me continue. More than half of the states have established a state infrastructure bank. How have infrastructure banks helped cities meet their infrastructure needs? And two, if there was a federal infrastructure bank, how can we best model this to anticipate some of the future needs in transportation?
Thank you for that question. We've had a wonderful experience with that in the state of Indiana, and particularly the city of Gary. It's not necessarily an infrastructure bank, but it's called Community Crossings Program, where we can get matching funds. We've utilized those funds every year to improve our infrastructure to the tune of about $40 million, and they've done it in communities, large and small, all over the state. We believe a similar program with the federal government would only encourage the improvement of our infrastructure and reduce the danger that we see on our streets now.
So in that program you mentioned, were those grants or low-interest loans?
They were grants, actually, and they were matching grants, and the smaller the community, the more you were eligible for in matching dollars.
Thank you for sharing that with me. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Balderson. No, I'm sorry, he's not here at the moment. Ms. Davids.
Thank you, Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and the witnesses for being here today. I represent the Kansas 3rd Congressional District, and we're fortunate to have a strong transit authority in my district in the Kansas City metro area, in the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, with a strong leader in Robbie McKinnon, who really feels the needs of our area and is doing an amazing job. And because Robbie understands our district and transit and transportation, he has helped push forward Ride KC's microtransit pilot, which is now in the process of expanding to add taxi-type vehicles to the fleet during high demand times. I had the pleasure of trying out the microtransit pilot not too long ago, and I am definitely on board. It's an innovative pilot that's taking people from back and forth between Wyandotte County and Johnson County, and riders can use this on-demand service to augment their commute. It's a project that's led by a local entity, and I very much appreciate the partnerships that are going on there. It's clear to me because of this and many people in Kansas that we have to move forward with newer models of mobility. And so my first question is for the mayor. I've heard you and actually a few of the other folks on the panel testifying today about the desire for the federal government to invest in and encourage investment in these innovative type partnerships and or ramping up pilot programs, especially where there are local collaborations. Can you elaborate a little bit on the ideas that you have for how those kind of programs, what should we be looking for and how can we encourage those investments or make those investments?
First, thank you for the question and for the example in the Kansas City community, regional community, because I think it's a great example of how all of these modes can work together. I'll give you another example from Northwest Indiana, and that is our double tracking project that we have gone through and our expansion of our commuter rail service. It not only uses the existing South Shore line and looks for expansion of that South Shore line to a new area, a new regional area, but it also uses on-demand service to meet the needs of some of our disabled residents. We believe that those types of models only come through through communication between local leaders, regional transit leaders, members of Congress, to encourage both public providers and private providers to come to the table, and that's done sometimes by challenge grants, by incentive grants that say, when you work together, you're more apt to get that type of funding.
Thank you, Mayor. And then, Mr. Martz, I believe you mentioned earlier the idea of having pilot grants that would eventually be integrated into transit and multimodal grants as moving forward. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, if it's going to be new, if you could provide new service that meets certain standards, meets the FTA regulations, could you apply for funding to provide new service, pass through with a public steward, and then if it's successful and continues and so forth, that it be made part of the regional core program and be eligible for formula funding on an ongoing basis?
And do you think that right now there's a dearth of those opportunities? That doesn't exist, and so we need to add more flexibility into.
Exactly. I think we need to add more flexibility for that. Your community is a little different, but even before, when Johnson County came over and started working with KCATA, I mean, there were opportunities prior to that. We've had other situations where a large, in San Francisco, it took 10 years to get the MTC to finally agree to work with us. And there were communities that wanted to do so, but they couldn't figure out how they would share the federal funding, and that was stymieing the entire process. We've resolved that, and just in the last year, our program has grown from 600 to 800 and probably be at 900 vans here just before the end of the year. So, I mean, it works.
Yeah.
It works, but you have to tweak the system a bit.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time and efforts here today, and I also just appreciate the recognition of I think the KCATA has been a pretty interesting and amazing model for some of this stuff, so I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Norman, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing your perspectives on the challenges and opportunities transportation network companies face. In just a few short years, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft have transformed the way we get from point A to point B, whether they're going to work, a doctor's appointment, out to eat, or even a public transit station. Millions of Americans increasingly depend on the services that TNCs provide. As members of Congress, it is our obligation to ensure that these businesses are prioritizing the interests of passengers, drivers, and the communities in which they operate. I'm deeply troubled by growing reports of violence and sexual assault by drivers, lack of safety oversight, and inadequate background checks. Faulty background checks and insufficient safety measures are putting passengers in Florida and throughout the nation at tremendous risk. In March of this year, a woman visiting my hometown fell asleep in an Uber and was assaulted by her driver. It was later discovered that the driver had an extensive criminal record spanning decades. Uber and all transportation network companies can and must do better on safety. As chair of the Education and Labor Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, I'm also concerned about efforts to misclassify workers and undermine their right to organize, which have led to protests by drivers and other stakeholders. That's why I led 3 hearings on the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, known as the PRO Act, which will prevent misclassification by clarifying the tests for determining whether a worker, including a rideshare driver, is an employee. I want to thank both Chairs DeFazio and Norton for being original co-sponsors of the PRO Act. The tremendous success that Uber, Lyft, Via, and other transportation network companies have experienced can largely be attributed to their drivers' efforts. They deserve to be rewarded accordingly. Like many colleagues on this committee, I'm disappointed that Uber, Lyft, and Via declined Chairman DeFazio's invitation to testify today. Nonetheless, I'm committed to working with Chairs DeFazio and Holmes Norton to find solutions to address many of the issues being raised today. Thank you, Chairwoman Norman. I have a few questions. Mr. Willis, in your testimony, you discuss how the ride-hailing industry see fair wages and collective bargaining for drivers as an impediment to growth and are actively working to undermine collective bargaining through misclassification. As you know, the PRO Act would expand the definition of employee and employer to discourage the classification of workers as independent contractors. How would clarifying the definition of an employee, like in the PRO Act, create good jobs for rideshare drivers?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for not only your statement, but for the tremendous leadership that you've offered on the PRO Act and other issues that are important to the labor movement and frontline workers. I think you're absolutely correct. The PRO Act, by quite frankly adopting what we've seen out in California in terms of how to properly classify who is an independent contractor and who is an employee, among other things, would ensure that those workers are covered by minimum wage standards so that we don't have drivers, below the minimum wage in some of the cities in which they drive, making as low as $3.75, as I cited earlier. And, if you create a framework where these drivers are employees, they then also have the opportunity to have a union voice on the property. We know that union workers across the board do better on both wages and benefits, working conditions, saying what goes on in the workplace than their non-union counterparts. And we think that is an important path forward for these drivers. So again, thank you for your leadership on these issues, affording these drivers basic rights. As I said at the outset, we're not trying to put anyone out of business here. We want to support these drivers and do what's right by them. And the right classification on employee versus independent contractor is an excellent place to start.
Very much, Ms. Wilson, and thank you, Mr. Willis. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Seeing none, I would like to thank our colleagues and each of the witnesses for their testimony today. Your contribution to today's discussions have been very informative and helpful, and I can assure you have enabled us to move forward with corrective action. I ask unanimous consent that the record to today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee is now adjourned.